In this screencast, we're going to take a look at the Vagrantfile that we've been using to configure our virtual machine. Now, so far, I haven't actually shown you inside the Vagrantfile. It's kind of just been there and been doing a lot of work behind the scenes for us. But now let's go ahead and open it up in Vim and see what we can discover about it. Now, before we actually start looking at the Vagrantfile, let me just clarify what its purpose is. So first of all, the Vagrantfile should be stored in the root folder for your virtual machine. This means that we could have other folders in here. For example, I could make another directory in here, and that would be perfectly fine, but you wouldn't put the Vagrantfile inside that other folder. You want to put it in the root directory of our project. And of course, that does make most sense. The next thing I should mention is that the Vagrantfile should be committed into the source control that you are using for your project. And if you think about it, this makes sense, because the Vagrantfile is the configuration for that machine. It describes the way the machine should be set up, and it also can potentially describe what resources should be installed on that machine. This is, of course, important information for other developers who may be using your virtual machine, so you need to make sure you do commit that Vagrantfile into your source control. Next thing you may notice as you begin to look at this file is that it is Ruby based. So even though it does not have the .rb extension, this is Ruby code that you're writing in here. And in fact, up here at the top, you can see that we have two comments that are up here to set the file type to Ruby for your text editor. Unfortunately, the Vim line doesn't actually seem to be working, because if I run setft, you can see that the file type is set to a conf file, a configuration file. I'm going to change that by running setft equals Ruby, and now we have Ruby syntax highlighting. So we start out by having vagrant.configure, and this method has a block which takes a config object, and everything inside of this block here is where the configuration is actually done. One note about this parameter here too, this is for the second version of the Vagrant config files. You may see older virtual machines that look like this, Vagrant configure without the parameter. However, for this screencast series, we're going to be using the latest syntax. So the next thing you notice here is that this file is really well commented. So you could go ahead and read through this to learn a lot more about how to configure your virtual machine. And in fact, we're going to be coming back to this file several times throughout this course to make a few tweaks and changes. But for now, let's just go through it and look at some of the highlights. So the first line we have here is config. Remember, this config object is passed into the block. So then we have config.vm.box is set to precise32. And this is the box that we choose to build our virtual machine off of. We could, of course, come in here and change it. Now, you may remember when we set up this virtual machine, we created this Vagrantfile by running vagrant init precise32. You could just leave that off, and in here it will just have a default. I think it will just say base or something like that. However, if you ever decide you want to change the box that your virtual machine is built on, you don't have to delete your Vagrantfile and reinitialize it. You can just come in here to this line and go ahead and update this string here to whatever you want it to be. Now, this next portion, which is commented out here, is kind of interesting. If instead of using a box that you have locally, as we are doing here, you want to use a box that's on another web server, you can do this by configuring the config.vm.box URL instead of just the box. Now, as you can imagine, this will probably take a little bit more time to boot up because it has to go ahead and download that. But depending on your setup, this may be useful to be able to get a box from somewhere online instead of using a local box. So that option is available. All right, now we come down here to port forwarding. You'll remember from the previous screencast how we were able to boot up a really simple Python web server, tell it to use port 80, and then use port 8080 on our local machine and access the web server that's inside of our virtual machine. Line 19 here is the line that configures this. We have configure.vm.network, and we are configuring the forwarded port, and we're saying the guest or virtual machine port should be 80, and the host machine will go to port 8080 to access port 80 on the guest machine. Now, of course, you can change this to be whatever you want. So for example, if you're using Rails on your virtual machine, you may want to change this to port 3000, which, if memory serves, is the default port for the Rails server, and you could change the host here to port 3000 as well. And this way, you'll be able to have the Rails server running on the virtual machine and access that from your local browser. I should mention that when you're setting up these ports, it's important to remember what virtual machines you have running at the time. I've had it happen where I've set up a virtual machine, I've been using it, and then I've just CD'd into a different folder or left my desk for the day. I forgot that I had that virtual machine running. Then I went to boot up another virtual machine, and it wasn't able to access port 8080 on my host machine because I had that other virtual machine running using port 8080. And so in this scenario, it actually will just choose another port for you to run on. However, that's something you do have to watch out for. Don't accidentally leave your virtual machines running because it will not free up those ports if you try to access it from a different virtual machine. All right, so let's keep going down here. There's some other network stuff that we have here. Here's something else that's important. This is the synced folder feature that we talked about. Now let me uncomment this line and we can look at how this works. We have config.vm.synced Now by default, we have a synced folder that's going to configure the current directory to go to /vagrant. That line doesn't show up here because it is a default, but if I enable this line, this will sync the folder /data, which is the data folder just outside of this current directory. So the data folder will be a sibling folder, if you will, to the folder that our Vagrant file is in. And that will be synced to the /vagrant_data folder on our virtual machine. So this allows us to sync any folder at all between our local host computer and our guest virtual machine. And I really think that this feature, the synced folder feature, in combination with the forwarding network ports feature, really make it as easy as possible to use a virtual machine almost seamlessly. These features allow you to create a virtual machine that really blends right into your local machine, and it makes using a virtual machine, and it gives you all the benefits of keeping your development environment separate and encapsulated on that virtual machine, but it gives you the ease of having everything locally. Let's see if there's anything else down here that we might be interested in. Now down here, we're going to come back to this. We have a section on provisioning. We can do a couple of different types of provisioning, and in fact, we're going to start talking about provisioning with first shell scripts and then with Puppet itself in the next couple of screencasts. So I'm going to leave this portion here for later, but as you can see, it's just as simple as a config.vm.provision, and we can choose our provision. We could use shell scripts, we can use Puppet. This also has some demo code here for using Chef Solo, if you want to use Chef. We're not going to be using that in this screencast, but it's very, very simple to enable a lot of this different provisioning stuff here on our virtual machine. So this is a quick look through a couple of the ways that we can configure our Vagrant virtual machine. As this comment up at the top here says, these are some of the most common configuration options that you may want to use with Vagrant. And so having these comments in line here makes it really easy for you to just come in here and change or add some configuration without having to go look up the documentation online. However, there is a lot more that you can do with your Vagrant file. However, we're not going to go into that right now. Instead, we're going to begin to look at the world of provisioning servers and how we can get Vagrant to automatically set up different software on our virtual machine for us to create that automated development environment.